Hey, welcome back. We are talking about household, the concept of households in Paul, both Paul's teaching and his practice. So far, we've seen it in Paul's evangelism strategy. We've seen it in Paul's ecclesiology, his doctrine of the church. And now we're going to explore the doctrine of the church a little further using kind of a comparison of metaphors. So take a second. Press pause if you want and think about some of the metaphors for church that come up in Paul's letters. If you're taking a class that I'm teaching, you might really want to pause and scan those letters, Paul's letters, and see which metaphors you find. Okay? Here are some common ones. The body of Christ. He's the head and we're the body. The new man. Or the new mankind. Previous video you saw that doesn't just mean a new man, but a new mankind. And not just a new self, not just a new you, but you as a member of a renewed humanity, right? What else? Temple. Yeah? We are a holy temple. We're each living stones, right? That's Peter, but we're each being built up into a temple for the Lord. What else? Let's see. Holy soldier, Ephesians 6, right? This holy warrior. When he tells us to put on the armor, that's a plural you, with singular armor. So like the church is armoring itself with righteousness and faith, right? All right. And there are others. All right. So a guy named Banks has done a lot of work with this. Let me just pause for a second. You can read Banks on familial metaphor in Paul's literature. Okay, we'll talk about that in a sec. But before I forget, this book, get the glare off, is really, really helpful. House, Church, and Mission by Roger Gehring. If you're looking for a good read on households in all of the New Testament and even the Old Testament, and then in Potentials for Practice, that's really, really great stuff. So if you take all the metaphors for the church in Paul's literature, and then if you take the number of times these are mentioned versus the number of times family metaphor or oikos metaphor is mentioned, you combine all these and still the familial metaphor outstrips all the others. Paul refers to church as family more frequently than all the other metaphors combined. Now, that tells you something. When I use particular language so predominantly that if you combine all the other ways I use language, I still am using it that one way the most, this is what that says. That syntax says that I think the church is this and is like this. That these, for me, are metaphors, and this is the core reality. In Paul's imagination, God is building a family. He's building a household. This is why Paul writes to Timothy, and he says this in 1 Timothy. He says, I am saying this to you so that you can know how someone should behave themselves in the household of God, which is the church. Period. For Paul, the church is God's family. It is God's household. It is the way God's economy comes from oikos, the way God's economy of distributing grace to the world, it happens through his household. So Paul refers to himself as a steward in God's household. He refers to us as sons and daughters. He refers to our adoptive position in the household. He talks about the household of faith. When he talks about financial benevolence, he says, be good, do good to all men, especially those of the household of faith. For Paul, there are all people who should be the recipients of our generosity, but especially the family, man. And the family is all the saints. So this is important because when we do theology with Paul, what you're doing is you're telling a story. So frequently we sit down into one particular metaphor, the bema seat of judgment. We think that Paul thinks that the whole big story is about getting forgiven so that we can not be guilty and we can be innocent, or at least forgiven, guilty but forgiven, and then justified so that we can not be punished. It's all legal language. And that does happen a lot in Paul's letter to Rome, less in the other letters. But what happens far more frequently, Paul is describing our inclusion in a household. So the way you go about being a Christian or being a saved person probably is really loaded up with ideas of how to stay forgiven, or questions of like, am I really saved because I keep sinning? There's lots of attempts at lowering the frequency of sins, and that's great. Don't sin. Great. But if the story you're living in is a story about a courtroom, then everything else in your life is going to get interpreted as the fallout of that courtroom or the lead up to that courtroom. And you're doing that because you've been taught that Paul does that. You've been taught that the Bible teaches that. The Bible does teach that. It also teaches lots of other things. But we have majored on that one particular image, the courtroom, for 500 years. But the frequency of courtroom language is a fraction of the frequency of household language. And this is what I'm trying to tell you. This is what Paul's trying to tell you, is that being part of the church is being part of God's family, God's household. And that growing as a Christian is growing in your ability to live as a member of that household, to sit at the table with the family. It's growing in your ability to follow your older brother's lead, to learn from him how to live with the Father. You're like an abused orphan found in the street, raised by wolves, beaten by merchants, and abused by the social system that got adopted. And your brother is teaching you how to believe that this Father is kind by being kind to you, and then teaching you that this is how we do it. We are the household of God. That's the household of so-and-so, and that's the household of so-and-so, and we are the household of Yahweh. And we love. This is how we do. And this makes so much sense of all of Paul's letters when he says, no, we don't do that. This is what we do. We don't do that. So don't do that, because that's not who you are. That's not how we do. All right. So for Paul uses lots of metaphors for the church, but the dominant one, by an order of magnitude, is family or household. That tells us that in Paul's imagination, the story we find ourselves in is a story of God building a family, bringing many sons to glory. If that's the case, then the way we engage culture needs to maybe not be as social activists or not be as mouthpieces, but we need to comport ourselves as a household, as a family in the world, trying to include others. All right. Next video is going to be about sound doctrine. That'll be fun. And then we're going to zero in on one particular household that Paul uses as an example of all of this. All right? Peace to you. Thanks.